Okay, I'm going to start. We are now about to start panel 2, which is about modernism and its discontents. And this panel will examine the role of design and planning practices in establishing the character of the city of St. Louis and its spaces. And we will look at those dimensions. We will look at that question historically, that is in terms of the plans and projects and policies that impacted the urban sociospatial formation of St. Louis from the early 20th century through to the early 21st century. But our concerns are actually primarily with the significance of those projects and initiatives, the laws they enacted and the policies they put into practice for today. So not only in terms of the spaces and the fabric that they created, we're interested in that, but not only that, more importantly in terms of the social and political agendas, the conflicts and the exclusions that they inscribed in those spaces and fabrics. So the central concern of the panel is with who has the power to impose social and spatial order, and what agency does urban design, or do urban design and planning have in that context. So implicitly, if not explicitly, actually modernist planning practices have been based on assumptions, and this is something that we've been talking about sort of over the last sort of half day, that assumptions about different kinds of spaces and the types of activities and people who belong in them. In other words, a kind of modernist concept of zoning. And government, as we know, and we've been looking at that, and I think that that's something that we want to pick up on here too, government at state and at federal and at local levels, in other words, at these interscalar levels or multiscalar levels, has played a key role in monitoring and regulating the social and spatial order associated with modernist planning. But I would argue, and I think that this is one of the things that we want to pick up here, the tools of modern spatial planning, from land use zoning to technical infrastructure, to, in fact, I think the very concept of blight, have their own agency. And so planning is not just an extension of policy, but it actually has its own agency. And then something else that I think is quite important here is that, I also believe, is that built forms and spaces, the built forms and spaces that circumscribe the daily lives of those who inhabit them, and that either provide or deny them access and or to the advantages and opportunities of urban living, also have agency. So I think that we want to look at plans, we want to look at projects, but we also want to look at the kinds of environments and the physical and material environments and how they actually impact. Because very often plans, intentions of projects do not result in what was intended, and that built form actually has a kind of agency beyond the intentionality of design. So on the agenda in the next 90 minutes will be several issues that affect the daily life and urbanism in St. Louis. Those include, as I said, this complex patchwork of local and state government, the policing of citizens and public spaces, and especially the significant design and planning interventions in the city from Harlan Bartholomew's Comprehensive Plan of 1947, and we're going to look at these things, actually see them, to the Mill Creek Valley, slum clearance, to the Pruitt-Igoe homes in the 1950s and 60s, and of course that racially segregated sprawl that followed in the wake of all of these projects. So the other thing is, that is important to highlight here, is that in addition to talking about the fragmentation and disorder that resulted from the imposition of much modernist planning practice in St. Louis, we are also going to consider recent and current efforts on the part of groups and institutions to organize urban life and urban infrastructures more equitably in the city. So we're going to actually look, we're going to bridge now into the second part of this conference, historically rooting these things in place in the modern movement as such. And so we're going to look at these projects that are dedicated to putting an end to this socio-spatial exclusion and the unequal distribution of both wealth and misery. And we want to look at in the city, and we want to look at it at the scale, again, at an interscale, multiscalar, but mainly interscalar way, at the scale of the house, of the street, of the neighborhood, and the city that has characterized St. Louis for so long. So I'm going to introduce all of the speakers together, now, so that we don't have to interrupt the flow of conversation. We have 4 speakers in this panel. The first speaker is Eric Mumford, who is Rebecca and John Voiles Professor of Architecture at the Sam Fox School of Design and Visual Arts at Washington University in St. Louis, where he also holds appointments in the Departments of Art History and History. And Eric Mumford is well known to us at the GSD. He spent a great deal of time here and at Harvard. He was an undergraduate at Harvard College. We always like to claim people. And he taught here also in art history. And he was the chair, actually, of the GSD's visiting committee from 2010 to 2014. He is also, and this is one of the reasons that he's here too, particular reason that he's here, is that he is the authoritative voice, actually, about the intersection of modern planning and modern architecture. He's the author of numerous books on the SIAM, the modernist organization, the congresses, the international congresses for modern architecture that took an urban agenda. So he wrote the definitive history of that. He's written a number of follow-ups to that, Defining Urban Design, SIAM Architects and the Formation of the Discipline, and many other publications. He's also written on St. Louis, on modern architecture in St. Louis, and he's currently working on, he received one of the Mellon Foundation Urban Humanities grants for visualizing urban history, and he's looking at the Mill Creek Valley event and how that project is being sort of displayed at the Missouri History Museum in St. Louis. So that's Eric, and then Eric will be followed by Heather Woofter, who's a professor of architecture at Washington University in St. Louis and is the chair of the graduate architecture programs. She also has a major architectural practice in St. Louis. She's the founding director of the firm Axiom, I'm not sure if I'm saying it right, with her design partner, Sung-Ho Kim. She has a B.Arch from Virginia Polytechnic and an M.Arch from Harvard. And she is also, she's taught in a number of different places. She curated an exhibition recently, well, actually it was in 2009, The Metabolic City at the Kemper Art Museum in Kansas City in Missouri, which was about the metabolists. And it's a very interesting project. I mentioned that here because, again, it's about the intersection between the urban and the architectural scale, and that many of these projects were about that. So today she's going to talk about her own engagements with St. Louis as an architect and teacher, and in particular on public projects in Grand Center. And she's also going to talk about a project that she's about to start called Citizen Space in North St. Louis that examines Pruitt-Igoe, the site, and the social and political implications of its possible futures, which, as I've heard, may be decided tomorrow or something, right? So, and then our third speaker is M.K. Stallings, who is an educator, a poet, and a community arts administrator, and the founder of Herb Arts, a nonprofit organization located in the Old North Street, St. Louis neighborhood that creates media platforms for youth and community development in St. Louis. MK is also a columnist for the St. Louis-based paper, the West End Word, where he often writes about the contradictions of transformative art and marginalized artists. He studied sociology at the University of Missouri, St. Louis, and that sociological perspective, I think, really resonates in his poetry as it does also in his community work. So today he's going to talk about Herb Arts, and he's also going to look at it in its historical context, taking it back to the Black artists group in the late 1960s. And our fourth speaker is Adrian Davis, who is the Vice Provost and William M. Van Cleve Professor of Law at Washington University in St. Louis. As Vice Provost, she focuses on faculty diversity and development. And in that role, she consults and collaborates with Washington University's 7 schools on diversity and leadership development and managing programs for the Office of the Provost. She chairs the university's Diversity Commission. She is also a noted legal scholar, and she's particularly known for her scholarship and teaching on gender and race relations, on theories of justice and reparations, on feminist and critical race theory, and law and popular culture. She's written extensively on the gendered and private law dimensions of American slavery and the legal regulation of intimacy and how culture and law converge to distribute justice. Today, she is going to bring this long engagement with the underpinnings of the legal system and its influence on people's daily lives, what she has called elsewhere the law of daily life. And she's going to bring this background to bear on the concern of this panel, which is, as I said before, who has the power to impose social and spatial order. And she will also discuss some of the current Washington University initiatives in St. Louis. So please join me in welcoming our panelists.
Well, thank you, Eve, for the very generous introduction, and also thanks to Dean Mostafavi and Diane Davis for the invitation. Hopefully this will be useful. It's certainly not my main area of study. I've lived in St. Louis for 20 years. I'm not from St. Louis, but hopefully it will be useful in sort of elucidating some of the things we've already been talking about. St. Louis is a place, of course, that was the 4th largest city in the country. In 1900, it was on a par with New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, classic 19th century railroad city, a city that also, as we already heard in Joseph's talk, was a focal point, one of many, of the great migration of African Americans from the South in the early 20th century. So that's the context, really, of both planning and segregation in St. Louis, as in other places. They both emerge at the same point, around 1910. It's the same point that the great exhibitions are held, the 1893 Chicago Fair and then the 1904 Chicago, Louisiana Purchase Exhibition, the point where the city starts to become spatially more dispersed, and the park, Forest Park, is the site of the fair, which then starts to move development westward. The private streets of the Central West End around the park become the place also where Washington University moves its campus at the same time as the fair. So that's all this context of of planning as well. The 1907 plan, the first effort to plan the region, actually precedes Daniel Burnham's 1909 plan of Chicago by 2 years. Very ambitious effort to propose parkways, radial boulevards, not only in the city but also in the county as well. Much of it not carried out, but certainly a kind of inspiration then for a lot of planning in the rest of the 20th century. But of course, as we've heard from Colin Gordon's very excellent work, where he's really deeply researched things far more than I have about the segregation patterns of St. Louis. It's also that same context that you have the effort to create a segregation ordinance, the beginning of a kind of spatialized segregation that moves beyond the old neighborhoods down by the river where industry was located and begins to shape first the city and then eventually the county, and even today down to the whole region. That's also the context where zoning is introduced. Residential zoning emerges in the United States in 1909 in Los Angeles, which was the first application of this kind of zoning. Basically, very familiar pattern of dividing up the territory into residential, single-family residential areas and commercial areas, and then variety of industrial areas. Much of that really beginning as a tool of segregation, actually in San Francisco in the 1880s, where there was an effort to forbid Chinese laundries. This was ruled to be unconstitutional, but then later in 1909, Los Angeles was able to implement this zoning ordinance, which had a lot of support from the real estate industry because it was a way to segregate without explicitly mentioning race. And so it's exactly that same kind of zoning that then gets taken up rather complexly in St. Louis, and I won't try to summarize that history, but by the 1920s, it's being very widely used, certainly in the St. Louis area and actually around the country. Very much advocated by Herbert Hoover, who was the Secretary of Commerce in the 1920s and then President, and upheld by the Supreme Court in 1926 in the Euclid versus Ambler case. So that, in a sense, is really a very decisive moment in planning as well. It's also the point where Harlan Bartholomew, the St. Louis city engineer, begins to develop his many plans for the St. Louis area, but also for many other cities around the country. And his archives are actually at Washington University. I think they're a huge resource for historians to look at the way that these metropolitan areas were structured, including places like Dallas and Los Angeles, from the 1920s onward. It's also a point where transportation planning becomes very significant. First streetcars, and then by the 1920s, traffic planning. All these things highly developed in Bartholomew's work and also in the work of other planners of the 1920s. All of it codified in his teaching at the University of Illinois in Champaign, as we heard from Ken Reardon, and then also certainly here at the Harvard GSD, where the planning school was founded in 1929 with a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation, and many planners, including Bartholomew, actually lecturing and producing monographs on planning practice in the early 1930s. That, of course, also is the point where, as Joseph explained clearly with actually a better slide of the same map yesterday, the Real Estate Board of St. Louis began to try to segregate the city, laying out districts in which African Americans could live legally, very small areas, largely around the downtown and in the area known as the Ville, but also including the Mill Creek Valley. These practices of the real estate industry were happening in a context, actually, of urban decline. Bartholomew had started to point out as early as, I think, the 19-teens, and certainly by the 1930s, that the city might be doomed to decline as the white middle class began to move to suburbs. And he began to map that in the 1930s, this famous map showing vacancies near the downtown, really the context then of a lot of the modernist replanning of the city from the late 30s down into the 1970s. And of course, the counter side to that, which I think we also need to be thinking about, is that's the point where these inner suburbs develop, often, and as I've done in a lot of my work, with a lot of interesting architectural outcomes, but very much in this totally segregated context of a kind of assumed deurbanization of the central city. It's also the context of residential slum clearance, the idea of the housing project, which really begins during World War I with efforts of the federal government to build housing for shipyard workers in eastern ports, the whole sort of idea of the government acquiring land by eminent domain, clearing it, rebuilding it in a standardized kind of way, including things like plumbing and wiring, things that were just new at that time, coming into public housing. Those ideas then returned during the New Deal in the 1930s. Bartholomew also significant in developing the idea of the neighborhood unit, which had really begun as a kind of suburban concept in the early English Garden City movement, as an urban way of clearing and rebuilding at higher densities. And so you can see some of the ideas that will lead to Pruitt-Igoe already present in the early 30s in this Bartholomew project for the Lower East Side in New York. Also in St. Louis, the idea of blight developed as a way of justifying the clearance of certain areas, not originally defined in racial terms, but rather as areas where property values were declining because the houses didn't have indoor plumbing. They were basically built in the 19th century. One of the first clearance areas in St. Louis, Neighborhood Gardens, an area on the near north side cleared by a philanthropic housing society as a low-rise, high-density project, which was originally for whites only, reflecting the general segregation patterns of St. Louis at the time. Those exact same ideas then informed the public housing of the 1930s, which were also racially segregated according to what was called the neighborhood composition rule, where it was illegal to build public housing in a neighborhood which would change the racial composition. So many of the well-known projects of the 1930s were built on that basis. This is the same context then that Bartholomew begins to map St. Louis according to neighborhoods, this introduction of a kind of planner's idea of the city as a set of neighborhoods. But interestingly, the Mill Creek Valley, right in the center of the map, is in an industrially zoned area. So even though it was going to be cleared and rebuilt for projects in the 1930s, it's not really defined as a neighborhood in the same way as the surrounding areas. It's also in this context in the 30s that you have the residential security maps that Colin Gordon spoke about yesterday, the idea of coding different parts of the, actually of the region, including the county as well as the city, according to mortgage risk established by the Homeowners Loan Corporation and then used by the FHA to determine whether or not they would insure residential mortgages. Any areas that were considered to be high risk, which the risk factors included the presence of more than 50% non-white population, as well as buildings in bad repair, over 35 years old, or having low rents, those determined the areas which then were redlined, which were shown on these maps prepared by the Homeowners Loan Corporation. Much of the theory behind all of that derived from the Chicago School of Sociology in the 1920s, where the idea that cities were inevitably going to grow at the periphery as all-white new suburbs were built and that the older inner ring areas were inevitably doomed to decline, much of this then becoming the basis for a lot of practices, not only of the FHA, but also of planners from the 1930s forward. It's important to remember all of this was occurring in a context of cities that are very different than the cities of today. These were large manufacturing centers, the future Rust Belt that emerges by the 1970s and 80s, lots of heavy manufacturing, not cities that were simply 19th century rail centers, but actually in many ways were also important world manufacturing centers really down into the 1950s. And that's the same context then where a lot of the modernist planning ideas start to come in. Gio Abada studies with Eliel Saarinen at Cranbrook in the 1940s. His thesis is on the St. Louis area, where you can see the population distribution very different from the present at that time. That's the same context as Bartholomew's 1947 plan, which very boldly calls for clearing the blighted areas, mostly corresponding to the redlined areas of the 1930s, that these should be cleared and rebuilt entirely with some kind of new pattern, a pattern of widely dispersed housing, both low-rise and high-rise, as well as new highways that will cut through the city and also be a tool of slum clearance. It's also that same moment right after World War II that the Shelley versus Kramer decision makes racially restricted covenants unenforceable. That then opens up the possibility of African Americans at least hoping to buy homes in North St. Louis and beginning the pattern of white flight that will continue down into the 1960s and 70s. Even before that, in the 30s, the decision had been made to clear the waterfront in 1936 as a New Deal project to create what was originally proposed to be a large monument to Thomas Jefferson. In 1939, the entire riverfront cleared, and the original proposal was for a neoclassical monument designed by local architect Louis Lebaume. After the war, this seemed sort of obsolete, and a new jury was appointed, local lawyer Luther Ely Smith sponsoring the competition. The jury included nationally known figures like William Worcester, who was then the dean at MIT, George Howe at Yale, Richard Neutra, CM member in Los Angeles, and Roland Wank from the TWA. And so they chose, they looked at 171 entries from across the country, many of them archived at the old courthouse in downtown St. Louis. They chose Eero Saarinen's 630-foot tall stainless steel arch as the winning design. This was considered by some to be unbuildable, a very bold decision by the jury at the time, and it actually took quite a long time before it was finally completed in 1965. That's also, though, the same context as the carrying out of the 1947 Harlan-Bartholomew Plan, the clearance of the areas around the downtown, the building of the first high-rise public housing, Cochrane Gardens, designed by local architect George Helmuth, which was originally a whites-only project, and that very much based on the model of the New York City Housing Authority, which had started to go to high-rise in the late 1930s in projects that were also largely racially segregated, originally mostly for whites only, which then began to gradually racially turn over during the war years and immediately after. Also important at this point, although not the only influence on this direction, was the ideas of the CIAM, the modernist high-rise housing based on the work of Le Corbusier and other European architects, much of which were then being applied very extensively in European countries, beginning in England right after World War II. So all that feeds into the ideas behind Pruitt-Igoe, designed by Minoru Yamasaki, a Japanese-American architect who worked with George Helmuth during the war in the Detroit firm of Smith, Hinchman, and Grills. And then after the war, they formed their own firm doing these large public housing projects in St. Louis, which again were racially segregated. Pruitt-Igoe unusual in putting a whites-only project named Igoe next to an African-American-only project named after the World War II flying ace, Wendell Pruitt. I won't go into the details of Pruitt-Igoe. There's quite a lot of research on it. What I want to emphasize really at this point is the way this is all happening within a framework of very rapid suburbanization that, as Colin Gordon has documented, much of that even more segregating in some ways than the patterns that were going on in the city at this same point, but also the context for a lot of the modern architecture in the region. And there's quite a lot of examples of that, much of which I've written about. All of it really meant to sort of in a sense, create a new kind of city that would be much more suburban, have higher standards of housing, but was for a long time, and still is in many ways, racially segregated. That's also then the context of the desegregation of schools, the Catholic schools in 1947, actually preceding the St. Louis public schools, continued efforts at rebuilding the center of the city, much of that supported by Civic Progress, a group of CEOs appointed by the mayor in 1952 that enthusiastically championed a 1955 bond issue of $110 million to further clear areas like the Mill Creek Valley, where the clearance begins in 1959, and then much of that rebuilt in a context of emerging civil rights activism, which Clarence Lang has written about, and other scholars, some of whom are here, have also worked on as well. That's also the context of the urban design program at Washington University, where various deans, beginning with Joseph Murphy in 1948, tried to modernize the school on the model of the GSD, and that's the point where further modern architecture happens in the St. Louis area. Roger Montgomery founds the Urban Renewal and Design Center in 1965 and is also involved in founding the Landmarks Association in 1957 before going on to Berkeley. He brings in Oscar Newman, the sociologist who develops these ideas of defensible space, using St. Louis examples, and much of the work actually beginning really with studies of Pruitt-Igoe before its demolition in 1972. One outcome of that is Laclede Town, a deliberate effort to create a low-rise, high-density environment that will be racially mixed, 50% white. The tenants very carefully selected to be artists and creative people, and all of this hopefully would be a model then for the future rebuilding of St. Louis. But unfortunately, as Pruitt-Igoe, Laclede Town eventually fails by the 1990s, much of the site still vacant today, and St. Louis extremely deurbanized, even compared to other Rust Belt cities. So really there are still very open questions, some of which have been addressed by some of the speakers already, about really what comes after this whole episode of modernist planning in St. Louis. Thank you.
Okay, great. So, as Eric's talk elaborated, the city of St. Louis has a complex history of socially engineered investments leading to shifting urban populations within the city. The result of these movements, such as neighborhood raising from government-sanctioned blight, highway infrastructure projects, federally funded housing, and white flight to the suburbs, left the city with disconnected neighborhood pockets. As a consequence, St. Louis is surprisingly green and also heavily paved. Many of the spaces are uncared for, and the neighborhoods with some funding to rebuild their infrastructure, such as Grand Center, the achievement of interconnectedness is still a challenging one. Previously, these institutions expressed themselves in architectural and urban spaces organized with bunker-like qualities. The clients expressed the need for large and protected parking lots, carefully measured transparency, and vandal-resistant facades. More recently, the conversation has transformed. Redirected to an expression of openness, community access to programming, and joint efforts that move beyond the property boundaries. I share an architecture practice with my partner, Sung-Ho Kim, and we've worked on several projects in Grand Center. This image is at the intersection of 3 of those projects: a public radio station, an interior for the public television station called 9 Network, and an infrastructural project called Art Walk. This image, taken from the parking lot fence, we need to protect the cars, begins to show the public engagement as it's hoped for on this site. I'm going to briefly speak today about these projects that we've worked on in the city and then move towards Pruitt-Igoe to speak on a very different kind of architecture and urban planning research project. This UMSL NPR building was designed as a gateway connecting local institutions to public media. More importantly, it represented a move from UMSL campus, which is isolated from the city, to a location in Grand Center and embracing the idea that the institution belonged to the city and to the residents there. The building has 3 accessible facades within the public plaza and between 2 media institutions. The massing of the building responds to these urban relationships. The cantilever on the southwest facade marks the threshold to the Media Plaza from Linda Boulevard and St. Louis University to the south, and the sawtooth facade on Olive Street allows for extensive east-west views of downtown. And we also have the garden terrace of the St. Louis University Museum of Art. All of these kind of pockets of opportunity are separated from one another. So in relationship to the Media Plaza that's meant to be between the 2 institutions, public radio and public television, the ground floor houses 2 open areas, a multi-purpose room for events and broadcasts, and a living room of academic functions that directly relates to Channel 9 television and their production studio across the plaza. So essentially, KETC 9 Network CEO Jack Galmish began a campaign to bring public radio and public television together. The large volume of the radio station production areas on the 3rd floor, northwest corner of the building, and the volume cantilevers to mark a covered terrace for viewing the large media productions on KETC's east facade. Programmatically, this relationship also works to contain acoustic-sensitive environments in mass. But the intent of this UMSL building is to promote the exchange of public media at various scales and modes of delivery. And the objective was to make the building as open as possible to the public, in contradiction to some of the buildings surrounding. The 9 Network interior project happened a bit earlier, and it was across the plaza as an interior project. And it was based on the relationship between light, open exchange of information, and visual connections of adjoining spaces and neighborhoods. The then KETC, which later named itself 9 Network, public television station, wanted a space of collaboration to engage the public. The interior was designed from a 4,800 square foot unfinished space designated for future use. And at the start of the project, our client described an idea about networks and light and handed us that book on the slide that you saw earlier. You don't often get a client that hands you a book as part of the programming agenda of the building, which was really fantastic. But he wanted to talk about networking and light and an open room to gather community around the lessons of public media and to be able to teach young adults, children, and others to be expressive in their community. It also included a bullpen for professional journalists to gather to teach the people that were engaging with public media who were novices adjacent, and that they would report the news. The space would later be modified into a television set for Stay Tuned. The set design incorporated 8 LCD monitors that allowed flexible reconfiguration for multimedia screening, derived from the idea of using a Google Hangout to do interviews and various social media interfaces. Conceptually, the spaces of the room are banded together through various light media. The public media is dependent upon an open exchange of information through a community of networks. And this translates to daily contact with subtle and not so subtle mediums of exchange and confrontation. The next project that we did that intersects that path was a project called the Art Walk. It was a project that stitched together a landscape joining several art and media institutions in Grand Center. These included the Contemporary Art Museum, the Pulitzer, the Sheldon, 9 Network, UMSL and Public Radio, the Fox Theater, the Scottish Rite, and St. Louis University, along with Grand Center. So it was fairly remarkable that we were crossing private and public land, that these institutions that had always been separated were now coming together to make decisions together. It is divided into 4 multicultural zones that are currently separated by parking lots, pedestrian inaccessible easements, and also gated building. The current condition of Grand Center allows few moments of connectivity. You actually can't walk from one building to the next. You have to get in your car to drive halfway down the block to get to the next event. So it made us think about connectivity and a sense of continuity between these urban spaces that were so close to one another. In addition, the project addresses the question of what is art, that art doesn't have to be objects. It can be about social relationships. It can be about the phenomena of our built-in natural environment. And by provoking a heightened sense of the site, ways of responding to the buildings that exist around on this path that weaves through it, the connected path encourages pedestrians to be observers and interface with the uniqueness of each urban room along the way. The distinction between institutions comes through the programming of the external spaces. There's a fear of vandalism, there's a fear of people hanging out too long in one place. So, it was radical that we actually provide gardens and places to sit and lighting that didn't exist. It seems like a very old and simple idea, but that was part of the conversation that we were having, is about how people gather on the streets, because the architecture was actually made in such a way that people would not gather on the streets, and it would only privilege those who would drive from institution to institution in their car. And we're looking at the Pulitzer that is trying to break down the gates and some of the other entry conditions that they struggle with. At the same time, we were also thinking of smaller scale. Several moments along the path were identified as situations deploying urban characters, what we call part architecture, and also part kind of industrial design elements. They interface with the landscape strategies to engage the public in multiple scales of activity. In addition to the devices on the site, the landscape design engages metaphorical pocket gardens of varying conditions in the space between them. The project was part of a greater framework plan in Grand Center. Ironically, the first executable part of the framework plan, as I understand it, for Grand Center is the construction of a parking garage. That will be the first project undertaken, and the street renovation that occurs right next to it. So regardless of goodwill and also innovative collaborations, the economic drivers are still dominating the conversation in terms of the order in which we begin to address some of these concerns. This desire for interconnectedness, public access, and collaborative structures that surpass private and public land ownership are in play as potentially positive models for the city. Still, the impact of an arts district is limited, and funding resources and complex political structures within the city challenge conversations of connectedness. Smaller arts organizations struggle to find a voice and build, and they have a hard time maintaining revenue streams to provide programmatic and space for artists' exhibitions. As part of an inquiry to further examine this connectedness, we participated in a collaboration between the artist Mary Miss and the Pulitzer Foundation. In the Marfa Dialogues, Mary Miss brought together St. Louis area artists, architects, urban designers, and scientists to think about issues of sustainability on a walk between the Pulitzer Arts Foundation and Pruitt-Igoe. The walk was intended to imagine projects that spur on the path between those two yet very, very distant locations. Hoping for seed projects, one of the real opportunities of the walk was bringing people together of differing disciplines and also backgrounds. For our part, we were teamed with a plant morphologist, Dan Chitwood, and he is an ongoing collaborator with my partner, Sung-Ho Kim, and they're working on testing biological urban frameworks in a project called Cellular Transformations. I myself had the pleasure of meeting poet M.K. Stallings during this and also subsequent Pulitzer-sponsored events. This led to creating a studio engaging MK and Jan Ulmer, one of our faculty members, who is a practicing architect who examines curatorial space in his research. So now the Graduate School of Architecture is collaborating with MK to envision possible building and landscape designs for social artists, expressing the need for a place within the city where artists and everyday people who might not call themselves artists can express themselves and reflect on their environment and also their daily life. It was also during this walk in the summer of 2014 that I learned of the city's desire to move the NGA to the Pruitt-Igoe site. I was first introduced to St. Louis as a child through my father, who worked in collaboration with the NGA, or the mapping agency, during the 1960s to the 1980s. So I culturally kind of come from that background. But shortly after he passed away in 2008, I decided to learn a little bit more about this obscure place and ran a studio reimagining the NGA in its current location. And its current location is right here. It's a very small building with a very large parking lot and a trucking industry and Anheuser-Busch surrounding it. So we have the current NGA and the proposed NGA location. So the federal government is considering several sites for the new facilities. They're running out of room. It's a structure that we can imagine going deep underground. And Andrews Air Force Base is one of the competing locations. They'll make the determination tomorrow, or they'll make the announcement tomorrow, I should say. This is a suburban site in Illinois. The decision will be announced tomorrow. Both states are providing incentives to encourage the NGA to move to their area. St. Louis stands to lose approximately 3,000 jobs and an estimated $2.4 million in annual revenue if the facility moves out of the state. Today, however, high-security facilities such as the NGA are rarely located in urban locations. The security requirements, this is the NGA in Springfield, Virginia, which boasts that it can fit the Statue of Liberty within its interior kind of atrium, and our kind of familiar NSA. But if you look at the parking lot and the area that it takes, it creates an island. The security requirements and sensitive nature of the work, combined with a massive footprint, encourages a remote campus-like atmosphere with heavy infrastructure and traffic growth. The contemporary typology manifests itself as office parks. So while the image of a mirrored black box, which came from this 1950 kind of origins of the National Security Agency and evolved into the black box image, and this building is wrapped physically in copper to prevent transmissions, which is part of its exterior skin. That image is no longer a preferred design image of national identity. Instead, the counterpart is a suburban camouflage, which is questionable in its denial of clandestine activities without providing any physical access or a visual typology of civic space. Furthermore, the NGA facility is too large to fit on the footprint of Pruitt-Igoe and would therefore claim 16 blocks to the north of the site, creating an island in the center of the neighborhood. So the move to Pruitt-Igoe seems counterintuitive, while the economic and job incentives give one pause for reflection on the potential value in rethinking the isolative patterns of these facilities or the location in general in the city. The early Paul McKee plan shows the NGA fitting on the Pruitt-Igoe site, part of his original proposal when the NGA announced that it was moving. And you can see it in the center. But it is now taking this entire swath of land, leaving the whole north side redevelopment plan with kind of a donut with a large facility in the center. So the federal government and local government actions that exacerbated segregation in North St. Louis in the mid-20th century are well documented. The abandoned downtown site in St. Louis mythologizes the failings of social housing in the 1960s, with the existing neighborhoods emblematic of ongoing social divides. Catherine Bristol writes in The Pruitt-Igoe Myth about the symbolic death of modern architecture, and the recent film of the same title tells personal stories of residents and police officers, and also describes the optimistic planning and subsequent disinvestment of the federally subsidized housing project. And these are images showing the kind of hopefulness of move-in day, and the raising of housing in order to make room for Pruitt-Igoe and to clean the neighborhood. In Lisa Martino Taylor's 2011 dissertation on the Manhattan-Rochester Coalition, it demonstrates one of the many low moments in the Pruitt-Igoe story that contributed to citizen distrust of federal actions. The military was studying the effects of radioactive materials on vulnerable populations without their consent in St. Louis from 1945 to 1970. Her study exposes the government's aerosol studies conducted in segregated high-density urban areas to consider weaponized radiation delivery systems by mounting them on Pruitt-Igoe housing blocks. And you can see statistically that 70% of the occupants were children under 12. Michael Allen, St. Louis historian and co-author of the 2012 Pruitt-Igoe design competition, The Unmentioned Landscape, recognizes the significant historical buildings and neighborhoods that were originally demolished through the St. Louis Land Clearance and Redevelopment Authority. The city of St. Louis, in February 2015, initiated and passed an eminent domain bill to claim the property of adjacent to the Pruitt-Igoe site in the 3rd and 5th wards. While the Board of Aldermen will need to approve each property under review for eminent domain, this bill could dramatically affect an area where some residents would like to see a continuation of residential zoning. Oops, I should go back. This resistance is quiet in comparison to the overwhelming support for the NGA. If this government project moves to St. Louis, how can local citizenry play a significant role in establishing the character and ownership of their neighborhoods? In a city where policing is a concern, how will perimeter security reflect different ideas about power structures? There's a 500-foot setback around the NGA facility and other kind of mechanisms to keep cars from potentially attacking the building. Substantial parallels are being drawn to the historic predecessor, as some are suspicious of planning efforts without deliberate effort to introduce new ideas into existing typologies. Connectivity in public space in less dense urban environments implies a need for design solutions that differ from standard development patterns such as these. Government buildings like the National Geospatial Intelligence Center of the NGA represent critical cultural spaces tied obliquely to civic space, zones in service to collective national identity. Yet the design of these spaces negates the possibility of public interaction, creating an island between the interior and freely accessed environments. At a time when individual identity and equality are in crisis, larger public agencies are also at risk of separating themselves from the very people that they are sworn to protect. We are facing a dislocation between individuals and agencies. The greatest risk to national security may arguably be inequity and ruptures from within the community. In this upcoming year, the Divided City project called Citizen Space with Eve Blau and Michael Allen puts plans to examine the role of government influence on formation and division of public spaces in St. Louis. The city has a long-standing history of government intervention and disinvestment, leading to inequality and challenges in sponsoring economic growth while respectfully considering the local citizenry potential. So we plan to situate the local discourse of St. Louis in a larger context of institutional structures, including the level of national government. Thank you.
All right, good morning, or good afternoon. Good afternoon, yeah. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Herb Arts, and I'll get into our mission and all of that stuff in just a moment. But first, I'm just going to go ahead and kind of move forward. So as already noted, several times about the plan for the city, and the plan for the city from roughly the 1940s, and the assumption that St. Louis would increase in density to about 900,000 by the year 1970, as well as you can see with, that you'll see in a moment. But for now, you see the plan for it. This is, to me, part of how we get to something like Herb Arts. Herb Arts is a Black-led organization. One of the things that we attempt to do is to try to support artists through our work. But it's difficult to support artists in a city that is so polarized racially, so separated residentially, and there's just not enough spaces where you might see artists who are might build audiences for artists. So part of what that looks like is some of this notion of what's blighted. So in that blighted, or the so-called obsolete or blighted districts as discussed in 1947, that's essentially where Herb Arts is located. It's in the Old North St. Louis neighborhood. It's one of those areas where, in truth, it's like the new development, which we had a couple million or a few $1 million dropped into this residential, into this mall area, that would eventually become this beautiful kind of boutique area. Is surrounded by abandoned buildings that are dilapidated, falling apart. It's surrounded by people who might engage in some recreational drug use. It's all kinds of sort of activity, and it's funny because when you think about how the plans or what the thought was for concentrating bodies into this downtown or north or concentrating bodies into this area initially by using high rises and things of that nature to try to head off some of the sprawl that would occur. The neighborhood now, as it stands in that particular ward, is not densely populated, obviously, and so one of the big struggles that I had as a person that works with Herb Arts is to try to get people to this area. So for the longest time for Herb Arts, we normally just didn't have people who would support our programs, our events, and a lot of businesses in that area, except for a business that was constructed back in 1906 called Crown Candy, simply didn't have the number of people who would flow through those spaces to support it. So then, what happens as a result is that you end up having these storefronts that are virtually doomed to failure, partly because you don't necessarily have the number of people necessary to support those kinds of efforts. Which for us kind of relates back to this notion of the Black Artist Group. So the Black Artist Group, which was formed roughly around 1967, which followed like this wave of idealism as proposed by Mary Baraka about having these spaces that are not only dominated by Black artists or artists of color, but making sure that Black artists could be recognized for their efforts, for their contributions and things of that nature. And that was roughly around the early 1960s. 1963, it would hit St. Louis and some of the individuals there and come in the form of this organization called the Black Artists Group. And this is their headquarters, which is near Jefferson, near the NGA site that Heather talked about. A few blocks south of that area, in what is considered the industrial area, what was considered the industrial area for St. Louis. So they had this building, they had this big industrial building out of which to operate, to do their programs, to have their workshops, as well as some of their events. And the problem, ultimately, even though this was funded by a couple of foundations, they weren't able to sustain those efforts, partly because of the lack of financial support and general support from St. Louis. So if we put this in kind of a timeline, roughly around the 1960s, as the population continued to decline, when we hit 1970, the city, instead of reaching this ideal of 900,000, was really somewhere around 700,000. And then when we begin to see deindustrialization that's happening, we're creating this rust belt of a city where factories are moving out of St. Louis, moving out of Missouri. These same artists were finding themselves not having the kind of audience to support their work. I mean, generally, people dug their music. They really enjoy the jazz, but they didn't necessarily show up at the box office in the way that was necessary. So by 1972, the Black Artists Group had shuttered its doors, and you can see some of the musicians here, such as Julius Hemphill, Oliver Lake, etc. They were on the road. They were going to Europe. They were leaving St. Louis. They were gone from St. Louis. And so that follows a general trend of what was happening, of depopulation from St. Louis. And you see this, again, manifestly with the Black Artists Group. So what do you do as a result of not having enough people to support your art, enough people to support your craft, and there's really no marketplace for what you do in St. Louis? Well, of course you leave, and that's what you saw. You saw people move to New York, and if they could find housing and live elsewhere, then they certainly would. Now, some people did stick around in St. Louis, and they ended up living in the Laclede, housing project. Well, not housing projects, but then the Laclede residential facility that ultimately became a housing project that went in the other direction, away from these high rises, but these low rise spaces. Ultimately, because the artists could not, support themselves financially, and so with all of that, with the absence of institutionalized support for Black artists in St. Louis, you would eventually get to something like Herb Arts. Now, what I want to note here is that BAG, the Black Artists Group, was a multidisciplinary arts organization. They were all about having musicians, jazz musicians, dramatists, poets, visual artists, etc., all under one banner. Right? So to me, that is a little bit like this whole modernist notion of having all these different kinds of groups of people who are living in the same kind of space. But of course, I'm speaking figuratively, I'm speaking symbolically about how these kinds of organizations had to exist. But why do they have to exist like that? Well, it was simple. As noted, there were very few cultural institutions that supported Black artists in St. Louis. So the artists had to figure out how to support themselves. And so BAG came about. But unfortunately, because of some of their political activity and the lack of financial support, they weren't able to institutionalize their efforts and shutter their doors by 1972. And of course, some of the members, as noted here, were just simply in the wind. They were gone from St. Louis. So now we cut to Herb Arts. Now, there were a lot of different efforts that happened between 1972 to 2014. But what I wanted to point out here is that this is part of the major redevelopment of this mall area that back in 1970 was imagined as a pedestrian mall space. So that street that you see was all covered in just pedestrian walkway. but it was also the site by roughly, I guess, about 1980 of businesses that were largely leaving that area due to white flight, due to black flight, due to depopulation of the old North St. Louis neighborhood. So these businesses just simply weren't getting the sort of financial support necessary from the people. They just weren't. They didn't have the residents who lived in that area, and housing projects such as the Murphy Blair, or low-income housing such as Murphy Blair, were just really dominating that space, and that, you know, as a result, they just simply weren't able to do what they had to do to survive. So out of that space, we have the opportunity to open up a storefront and try to situate what we do organizationally within the history, within the tradition of the Black Artists Group and similar groups that formed in St. Louis since that time. As a result, we ended up doing some pretty interesting art shows. What this represents is a moment for Herb Arts where we began to move from attracting maybe tens of people to ultimately hundreds of people, and it all really started January 1st of this year. Heather mentioned the art walk that happens in Grand Center, so we began to do our own art walk in Old North St. Louis. And the art walk in Old North St. Louis largely attracted somewhat mixed-race crowds, multicultural crowds, as you can see here in this photo. So this is inside of Herb Arts. And this is one of the poets who were competing in the Poetry Slam. But what you see mostly here is some of the art in the background, and you see what could be within a legal limit of 120 people in the space. You know, it might be more, but I can't tell for sure, nor would I say it publicly. But what it speaks to is just the interest that we were able to create. And so on that night, we probably had about 300 or so people who were floating around that same development that we saw just a moment ago. Let's see if I can go back. This same development a moment ago. So you can just imagine this business and then people flowing down this street and going to the different galleries that were participating in the art walk. So that's part of it. And just last first Friday in March, this guy here pulled out about crisp $100 bills and bought that piece of art that you see him holding. It's a piece of art by a visual artist by the name of Roland Burrow, who has quickly become one of the emerging artists out of the art scene in St. Louis. And for the First Friday Art Walk, this was kind of a landmark moment of somebody actually spending more than just $100 or $200. This is our highest sale for the evening, and thankfully this guy came along to do that, which enabled the artist to have some money in his pocket. What you see here is another thing that we do. As I mentioned before, Herb Arts does something with the poets. And again, it kind of keeps in that tradition that was established by the Black Artists Group in the late 1960s. But this is our Poetry Slam team. Poetry Slam being this national competition. And so in order to give meaning to how the poets construct their work and the kind of work that they put in, the sort of dedication, Poetry Slam creates just a venue for poets to share their work before large audiences. So regardless of the competition nature of the slam, it really gives a platform for the artists. And so right here, right outside of Herb Arts is some of the poets who compete in the slam, and you see it at 14th Street in Warren. Just down that street, you will find Jackson Park Apartments, which is a low-income space for the elderly as well as for people with disabilities, and unfortunately, people who partake in recreational drugs. But it's a deep kind of thing, you know. So that's where we exist. We exist in a space where you have all kinds of things. And this is a quick poem that I won't necessarily read, but it goes like this, well, all of it anyways. Have you ever seen a jungle covered with broken concrete sidewalks surrounded by patches of grass we call yards, with or without a fence, where a telephone pole tower tower the trees with who knows whose shoes boomerang on those wire, were those homes that have turned into statues, walls of brick homes slipping from the thread of cement, resembling falling rocks from the mountainsides. These homes are decaying into the soils they were built on. Debris shuffles my block like wind blowing crumbs to help me get back home. Cause vacant homes look like twins, identical markings of abandonment. You would think I would get lost in these ruins where dogs roar like lions, grass grows over me, empty lots where once a house stood now lives yellow dandelions and trash next to a bush of roses on top of glass above the soil, etc., etc. So this is a poet who comes out of that same Poetry Slam group, who grew up in these kinds of environments that pretty much captures what the rest of Old North St. Louis looks like beyond North 14th Street. And again, this also speaks to some of the community engagement that we were able to accomplish, and then the multiple disciplines of arts that we support. You can see one of the paintings in the background. You can see the scuffed up floors that I have to clean all the time. And you see a breakdancer who's able to find expression for his work in Old North St. Louis. And you see some of the young people that were able to work within this space, because the same poets who are on that slam team then turn around and do work of mentoring young people and helping them to do more and more of their kind of work in the community. Last but not least, the gentleman that's in between these nice young ladies, he's now a poet that's on this adult slam team, and it just kind of speaks to, again, what we do organizationally, which is about creating platforms and platforming creatives for youth and community development, and ultimately having to create its own marketplace just to support the artists who were there, because otherwise there would not be the sort of infrastructure to support it. Thank you very much.
I want to thank you all for being here, and especially thank the partnership between the Harvard Graduate School of Design and the Divided City Project at Washington University. I really believe that the Divided City Project is one of the most important initiatives at WashU right now. So I'm delighted and heartened to see this partnership and to see how it evolves over the next few years. And I also want to say what an honor it is to present with my colleagues from the Sam Fox School. I feel like I always trot around behind you guys, so it's nice to be able to share space with you. You know, if one of the tenets of visual modernism is the move away from representation to abstraction, then modernism pervades the relationship between many universities and our local political economies. And over the long run, universities can change almost anything. We can change our student body. Certainly we've done that at Washington University, going from a local commuter school to a global research university in really just a generation or two. Over the long run, certainly universities can change our faculty. Certainly we can change our administration very quickly when we want to. The one thing universities cannot change is where we're located. And this surfaces, I think, really a deep built-in tension between many universities and our cities. As we've heard, beginning with last night and through today, the urban core of the United States remains deeply segregated and deeply under-resourced. And we find, as you've been seeing in the maps that people have been showing us, we find intense structural poverty alongside great wealth. Earlier today, one of the folks in the audience asked, you know, how do we pay for this? How do we bring economic drivers to St. Louis? Which is something we think about a lot. But as Walter Johnson and others pointed out, there is great wealth in St. Louis. So it's a matter of distribution of wealth and not purely a matter of building something up that doesn't have any resources. I live in the city, but I live in one of the most wealthy zip codes, 63108 Central West End, less than a mile from some of the most devastated parts of the city. I'm situated right at the Delmar Divide, and can speak to how many of my white friends really will not cross that mile. They'll go miles the other way, but really become very hesitant about crossing that, and MK, I think you pointed that out really well. That really creates significant issues in terms of how we facilitate black arts, where there's a move that we have to bring the black arts into the white spaces because white folks will not go into the north parts of the city, north of Delmar, to see those spaces. So So WashU St. Louis, I'm going to sort of put a little slash in there. WashU St. Louis is emblematic of a set of university/city relationships that have reached a boiling point across the country. And of course, other university-city dyads have long known this. Yale New Haven comes to mind, as does Duke Durham. So I want to very quickly sketch a spectrum of how university-city relationships might look. So we have the classic college towns, in which the college or the university really dominates the entire economy, almost a classic company town model. At the other end of the spectrum, I think you have the Columbias, the Georgetowns, and the UCLAs. These are large universities that are located in global economies. And certainly each of these universities is a very important driver of the economy, but no single university would dominate the political economy of New York or DC or Los Angeles. So finally, in the middle, you have a set of universities that I would call anchor institutions within our respective local political economies. So these are typically mid-sized cities that have probably just one, maybe two, research universities that play a crucial role in that city and region alongside a set of other anchor institutions. And many of these are old trading cities, what I called old river and a railroad cities, that reached their peak either during the Gilded Age or in the mid-20th century. This would be the St. Louis's, the Clevelands, the Pittsburghs, Birminghams, Detroits. And often the university has far more resources than the city itself, right? This is another one. So just to make a quick point of contrast, certainly Columbia has engaged in a lot of partnerships with Morningside Heights and with Harlem, but when you step outside of that immediate neighborhood, the city of New York itself has immense resources. So the anchor institution model, I think, is characterized by the interdependence between the university and the city. The city desperately needs the universities for human capital and as economic and sometimes educational drivers. And crucially, the universities need these regions to thrive in order for the university to survive and thrive as well. I would contend that, again, it's the specificities of the scale, the proportion of employment and economic resources that heightens the interdependence. And when you add in faculty and students, who tend to be decidedly liberal left, it can generate quite fraught relations. But there's also, I think, a lot to inspire us and to think about in terms of opportunities. These relationships within these anchor institution models can bring immense opportunity to rethink the historic economic and political relationships. So Washington University, I think, has long been emblematic of this anchor institution relationship or dyad, but in a way I'd say that much of the, and I think the city of St. Louis certainly knew this, I'd say the senior administration knew this, but I would also say that I think probably many of the other people within the university probably were not as aware of this. And just as a quick point of example, when I moved to the university about 9 years ago, the realtors really wouldn't show faculty looking to buy anywhere, I'd say, east of Central West End. I'm sort of looking at Eric and Heather for affirmation on that. And so you sort of had this sense that there was Central West End, and then the next thing was the river, and you didn't want to fall into the river. So you wouldn't go any further than that. And there are long-standing, thriving, wonderful neighborhoods in St. Louis that my colleagues who have spent 30 or 40 years at the university have literally never heard of. When I first moved there, many people wouldn't eat out in the city. Everything was sort of within our little bubble within the university and the incorporated townships. I think that Ferguson probably did more to explode that bubble than anything else probably in the last 50 years or so. So for people, I think, who were unaware, it made them very aware of the interdependence. And for those of us who were aware, I think it really reinforced the fact that we needed new models, right? We would be watching television. I might be at the gym, and then I would have I would have the television at the gym muted, and I would be watching a scene of tanks and fires, and I couldn't tell whether I was watching Afghanistan or whether I was watching something that was occurring 10 miles from me. I literally couldn't tell the difference. So let me be clear that the relationship between St. Louis and Washington University is not formally part of my portfolio. It's something very much that the Chancellor and our Chief Administrative Officer, Government Community Relations, our Board of Trustees, they manage all of those things. However, Ferguson, I think, really uncovered and generated a new set of opportunities on the academic side. And I'm going to give a little bit of an overview here, because this is a piece, I think, where universities really can try to create some new partnerships. So some of the things that we've done as a university and things that we need to do much more of are to really support St. Louis becoming a hub of innovation. Now, the way that we've chosen to do that, which is really focusing on the biomedical aspects of innovation, it is succeeding, it is bringing jobs, it is bringing capital, but of course that tends to skew very much towards people who have very, very high skills, and the location of a lot of those, it tends to be what we call the central corridor, so it's not really getting out of the central corridor to really, I think, affect the areas that need it that much. And we have people who are focused on this, but it gives me some pause about what that's going to mean. Something that gives me some optimism is something that we're calling the Fashion Fund in St. Louis, which is a fashion incubator. We recently hired Eric Johnson, who was the fashion liaison between the mayor's office in New York City and the fashion industry, to come out to St. Louis and to try to help us become a fashion innovation city. And the reason that I find that heartening and inspiring is that, and St. Louis used to be a fashion hub, is that fashion jobs tend to bring manufacturing jobs, production, distribution jobs that are available for people who do not have the high skills to go work in the biomed startups, right? So this is something that I find heartening if we can find a way to really support it. The thing I really want to talk about, there's some things that we're beginning to test out. To me, I think one of the university's absolute most precious assets and biggest resources, of course, are our graduates. And one of the things that we were beginning to note is that our students who had spent anywhere from 4 years to, some of them stay and do their graduate work as well, so it could have been anywhere from 4 years to 10 years in St. Louis, we found that they were emailing us, right? Very recent graduates, people who were a year or two out, saying, either I'm still in St. Louis looking for a job, or I want to come back to St. Louis. I want to serve. This is one of the things that we pride ourselves on, servant leadership. I want to serve. I want to help. What can I do? So we're kind of racing around trying to match up these incredibly talented students and graduates with so much to give, but a lot of our not-for-profits and the government sector don't have the money to hire them. So one of the things that's being pioneered by the Gephardt Institute, which is our Institute for Community Engagement, is what we're calling an Urban Fellows Program, in which recent graduates will be paired up with, initially it's going to be the mayor's office, and we're hoping then to expand it to not-for-profits as well, be paired up for a year at relatively competitive salary to do work on helping the region become more resilient. So you can imagine then some students are working in the mayor's office, in the Office of Resilience. Other graduates will be, ideally would be working with some of the not-for-profits that are working on resilience in other areas as well. And again, what I really like about this is it's taking, again, one of the university's most precious resources and assets, which are our graduates, and pairing them up with a city that's in desperate need of additional human capital. Something else that we did on the other side of the academic mission, which is the faculty side, was we created something called a Ferguson Academic Seed Fund. And the Ferguson Academic Seed Fund was designed to really support the academic mission and to support our faculty who are working on the broad set of issues that we call sustainable urbanism. And that is a term that I shamelessly ripped off from our School of Architecture, which has a sustainable urbanism program, but it's really looking at the broad set of issues that pervade the urban core in the United States: health disparities, economic disparities, policing challenges, First Amendment issues, housing in the built and the segregated space. All of these things. We purposely and very intentionally designed the fund to be something that would be truly interdisciplinary, in that all 7 of our schools arts and sciences, law, the business school, the medical school, the Sam Fox School of Visual Design, the School of Engineering, and of course our School of Social Work and Public Health, that every single faculty member would be able to see himself or herself in this in some way and would be able to apply for funds. We also wanted to do it in such a way that would help other institutions, so we put in multipliers. If a faculty applied and was collaborating closely with another higher educational institution, especially if they were doing so with one of the institutions that are more under-resourced in the region, we gave them a multiplier on the grant. We also, so it was funded by the Office of the Provost and the Chancellor, we also immediately had come in several other campus partners. Our library system came in for any grant that was going to also be working on documenting and archiving their projects to preserve the legacy of Ferguson. Our School of Business came in to support any grants that were touching economic issues, and our School of Public Health came in to support any grants that were doing that. So I want to end by just showcasing a couple of the grants, especially on the design side, that I think that we are most proud of. So one is by one of our faculty members in the Sam Fox School of Design, Jennifer Colton, called Higher Ground, which was about a set of photographs she had taken of Washington Park Cemetery, which is historically African-American cemetery located near the airport when rigid segregation was the common practice. I'm going to read very quickly from her proposal. The cemetery's long and tragic history reveals a complicated tangle of social injustice, racial politics, imbalance of power, and dismal neglect. I began my work at this site in the 1990s, soon after moving to St. Louis. The cemetery's land was not only beautiful, it also happened to be very valuable. The adjacent airport wanted part of the land for its runway expansion, and I'll just kind of cut to the chase, so they took it, including disinterring the bodies. So Professor Colton took photographs that were, quote, in part protest, in part tribute, and in part historical documentation. They reveal the beauty of the landscape, nature taking over the order of the cemetery, and the disruptive process of the excavating of the graves. It's a project intended to honor the people touched by decades of oversight, neglect, and disruption. So she partnered in her project with the Missouri History Museum and also the Sheldon Galleries, which is going to do an exhibition of the photographs. And our library system is working with her to archive and preserve the photographs. I'll share with you one more, or two more very, very quickly. One is a project by Professor Andrew Ramus, which is to develop a course that would create the creation of a new place-based version of an older course that will develop practical hands-on approaches to immerse students authentically in the Old North City. Students will come to the neighborhood with a sense of humility, asking to become part of social structure and seeking acceptance to contribute meaningfully to it. Rather than entering as outsiders from an academic vantage point with the intention of taking something from the neighborhood, we will establish a home base, allowing students to participate in the community life to the extent possible in a semester-long course. So those were two really prize grants, both from our Sam Fox School members. And then a final grant came from one of our professors of public health, who's actually situated in the Department of Surgery, called the Black Body in White Space. And what I loved about her project, she says, we're going to conduct preliminary studies to support research into whether city green space is racialized as white space, thereby creating exclusionary symbolic boundaries that limit Black access to free health-promoting resources. Specifically, we intend to conduct a field experiment to ask whether Black park users are more likely than white counterparts to invite sanctions from white onlookers and also from white state agents. And there were many more you can find. If you'd go to the WashU website and type in FASTF, Ferguson Academic Seed Grant, FASTF, it'll take you immediately to our site. I very much see this as a first step in which the university can really empower our faculty, and students are also very involved in these projects as well, to design their own research, their own curriculum, to think about these issues. And so we're very much looking forward to the next steps, and maybe we can talk about that during the question and answer. Thank you.
thank you all. This is really interesting and very and diverse. One of the things that strikes me very much about both the history and the projects that the contemporary projects and thinking about the city, and that is this issue of scale and the sort of operative scale of intervention. And it seems to me that, you know, we've looked at these projects, for instance, Heather's projects and MK's project in Herb Arts that are of a kind of small, intricate scale within the city. And then there are these large-scale things like, you know, the NSA project, and I would say then there's this in-between scale, which is the university, and the university as a kind of urban agent. And I think that that's an extremely interesting thing that is at the kind of middle scale. So I was, actually I think because we've completely run out of time, I don't know how much time you're going to give us for this, but I think that I just would like to open it to the floor for questions for people who want to engage. Yeah.
Well, I just put I don't have to go first. I just want.
Well, that's fine. Perfect.
Okay.
Somebody's got to go first.
So I actually taught at Washington University and St. Louis University, so kind of experience with two very different kinds of institutions that have different sorts of orientations towards the city over the long run. But in all the cases, when I taught at those universities and now at the New School in New York, and I do a lot of work with students in communities, the question that I sort of constantly have on my mind, and I'd love to hear what panelists would have to say about this, is how do we do this kind of work in neighborhoods, in communities, in a way that is not simply an extractive process. That is, that knowledge production is a mutually generative and beneficial process and not something that is merely extractive from the community to the university, because that vector is a very strong one in the work that we do a lot of times.
Something that we talk about at Washington University, especially in the School of Architecture, because I think that there's a tendency in the past to go into neighborhoods with, you know, busload of students and, you know, do research kind of examining the neighborhood, and it makes public relations, and it kind of is another form of disinvestment in a way. It kind of alienates the two groups and makes a separateness. So I think in our school anyway, we always ask ourselves the question, you know, what benefit is coming to the community by these partnerships? And we've started, we have a new person, Liz Kramer, who's working in socially engaged practice. It's a new addition to our Sam Fox school, but it's someone who's dedicated to just helping manage for faculty socially engaged practices to ensure that we have a positive relationship on both sides of the equation, and to kind of almost in a way write out a memo of understanding before we start a project. You know, that says, you know, here are our guidelines and what we need pedagogically for the students, and here are the kind of opportunities that might come out of this for our partnership. So I think that kind of memo is incredibly important, and it leads to further partnerships through word of mouth and you know, success. So I think success builds success, and so we really are cautious after a long history of not doing it so well.
Well, you know, for us, the reason why we exist and we have the great partnership right now working with Jan Ulmer out of Washington University with his studio. But the reason why we have to have those kinds of relationships, obviously, is because when you're under-resourced, you're undercapitalized, you just cannot autonomously do what you want to do. And again, when you talk about the north side of St. Louis, as mentioned before, not only is it like a dearth of people, right? About 100,000 people, you know, live in the north side of St. Louis. About the other 2/3 live in other parts, the Central Corridor, Southern Corridor, south of Delmar. But not only do you have that, but like in 63106, which is where we're situated, is one of the poorest zip codes in St. Louis. It's a high poverty level. So that means that the people who live there necessarily cannot buy a piece of art for $600. The people who live there may or may not be engaged in these kinds of conversations. And then to be able to bring in more people, well, they have to not be fearful of coming to North St. Louis, particularly our neighborhood. So anytime that we can work with an institution to help further our goals and objectives, regardless of even what they think they're getting out of it, as long as we're clear about our needs, then it can be a mutually beneficial experience. And as someone who's had the privilege of actually working with the institution and being an intern in Old North St. Louis back in my undergraduate days to now being a leader of a nonprofit organization in that same part of town, what I often find is that even though there might be a concern about institutions coming in and extracting more, if you know who you are and you police the process, there's no reason why it has to be exploitative.
And I'll just say very, very quickly that I think it's one of the things that we worry about the most is, we're doing research on people. And they're very aware of that. So I think, I'll just point to three quick things. So one is enhancing pipelines. One of the things, obviously, that universities do best is education. So trying to create real, meaningful partnerships with some of the charter schools and also public schools in the region, and also creating pipeline programs that really do help the local St. Louis kids have meaningful paths to high school graduation and ultimately into college, and then some partnerships with some of the other local open enrollment institutions as well, I think is really important. One of our faculty in public health created a fantastic program of pulling in people who she called community research fellows, I think. So she trained community members in how to reduce health disparities. So they got, I think, a small stipend. They spent the year being trained and certified and then went back out into the community. And importantly, they said, we don't want this to be NIH funded because then we'll feel like research subjects. So instead, she got funding initially, and then the university funded it for a little while as well, because otherwise there is that sense of studying people. And then the final thing that we've done, and I think we should do more of it, is our housing program. Housing in St. Louis, if you live there, it's so affordable. You can get a house for $60,000. And so one of the things we're trying to do is really empower our employees, our faculty and staff to become, I love your term, urban agent. So we have the housing program, and I think we very much need to, so it gives them $6,000 or $8,000, which in St. Louis can be a down payment to buy houses. And we're expanding the circle of neighborhoods that we're investing in. If I had my way, we would be doing it in every zip code under a certain income, but that's why I'm not the head of the university, because I would do those kinds of things. But we have expanded it, and hopefully we'll continue to expand it, so that empowers our employees, especially our staff, many of whom are rooted in these neighborhoods, to invest meaningfully in those neighborhoods. So thank you for the question.
Well, I just had a couple of comments, starting from Eric and then ending with Adrienne. I want to thank you first for name-checking at least two of the places that I lived, Pruitt-Igoe, 2140 Cass. I think that picture's been following me around since I was 5 years old. And Laclede and the Black Artists Group, and Oliver Lake, who was not just a great musician, a fixture in the community, and we saw him play at the Circle Coffee House, and he was in the community. The Bag Group was in the community, and I was sorry to see them go, but I smile every time I saw the World Saxophone Quartet in New York. But a lot of St. Louis musicians followed that path. But on the, I guess the comment on, part of to me, the real discontent of modernism and the probably the biggest urban failure of that Bartholomew plan, but it wasn't just Bartholomew, it was Justin Herman in San Francisco, Robert Moses, Ed Bacon in Philadelphia. This was a movement is that it removed that whole section that Heather was looking at the Port Igo site, removed it from the city grid and turned it into this very special island with no connections to services. And when I went back to look at those European examples, whether it's the Stuttgart or Berlin, they're in the city, connected to rail, connected to everything else. This was different. And so recovering from that isolation has been incredibly difficult. And as you see, it's the forest said, well, while you're waiting to figure out what you're going to do, we're just going to turn this back into forest. And to Adrienne's point, I'll be talking about this later, but I actually do think there is an opportunity for the city and the research university acting as that new driver of economics. We don't make stuff out of steel anymore. The place where Cortex is now was U.S. Steel, if you remember driving down that part of St. Louis. And others, Skull and Steel, there's lots. But what they do is there's an opportunity for the research universities to be a stronger actor in helping the cities develop, because, as you absolutely pointed out, the brand of the city and the brand of the university are coincident. They have to work together. So I want to thank you for that. And we'll be talking later. I've got a plan.
Good. Yes, I think one more.
So I'll make mainly a comment. Thank you all. Eric, I use your last slide as my first slide when I go around the country and make talks about St. Louis, is to talk about the sprawl. And the need to be focused back in the inner city, and density is our friend, everything that we know here. If I was to give a hug, it would be to MK and the work that he's doing. I'll give a challenge to WashU in general and we have partners here that can help and bring more artistic endeavors to North St. Louis. Partners with other groups, certainly from the Contemporary or the Pulitzer, should be partnering and helping in some of the fledgling work in North St. Louis as a whole, not just the whole North St. Louis neighborhood. The thankfulness we have now for the Gephardt Institute doing the Urban Fellows is pretty important, because it's hard to get high caliber talent into our bureaucracy. So there are 3 that are going to start in August. One will be working on resiliency, and remember, we're talking about the resiliency through the Rockefeller Foundation as being in many ways helping to eliminate disparities in our community. The second is going to be focused on vacancy and abandonment, another huge issue. So great. And the third one is sort of be determined, because the list is so long as to what to do with the third one. So one thing I do want to comment about is, as universities do partner with communities, is we haven't nailed it yet in terms of making that connection between being studied and listened to and not action. So I appreciate the idea of some of that contractual stuff. We got to crank that up a little bit more and really nail that. I will say that I think there's a golden opportunity to do just that between these 2 great universities in terms of Dr. Martin Luther King Drive in St. Louis. And we need to think about that. The last thing, and I know we're going to break, is we made reference to something that's happening tomorrow in St. Louis. But what's going to happen tomorrow, and I can define it in 2 different ways, but I'll leave it with this, and we should spend just a moment or 2 talking about it this afternoon. Urban America is going to take a punch tomorrow by a decision that the federal government is making. And I'll leave it at that, and we'll talk more this afternoon.
Okay, well, I think we're going to continue this conversation over lunch.
Great.
And when we come back at 1:30, so it's going to be a quick lunch.
For panelists at 1:21.
Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you, panel.
Thank you.